Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Incredible Hulk, episodes 10 through 13. So, when going into this, immediately I'm just like, you know what? I'm kind of much more impressed by this show the longer I start watching it, or the longer I keep watching it. Like, every episode, I'm just kind of like, wow, like, you know what? For the time, yeah, there's probably some goofy looking imagery and stuff like that. But like as a whole, like these episodes like are getting really just kind of better and creative and really good. Like I was kind of really impressed while watching this show, and like the more that I went into it, I was like, man, like I'm really getting into this show more than I thought I was going to. So ultimately, I'm kind of doing a lead up here to kind of talk about these episodes in a very cryptic like sense, with the exclusion of ultimately just going like, oh, okay, well, like here are some people that are otherwise inlined in these episodes. Uh, we really have it to be kind of like we have it to where there's like one episode and then we go right into like a three-part story arc after this, which I was kind of just like really liking the build up of that story arc. We really have it to where ultimately uh, it seems that at some point we can almost have it to where almost anyone could eventually become a Hulk. At some point, we've had it to where She Hulk has been lined up, but now we're having it to where seemingly anyone could become a Hulk at some point, which I kind of find is interesting and or fun. So going along into this episode, or going on into these episodes, I mean, we end up having to where reasonably there is still, of course, like big monster fights big monster for most of this, or we end up kind of going back to same or for we end up going back to some kind of familiar territory where ultimately we have it to where, okay, like we've already established this character, let's bring them back and ultimately go and have a big old fight out, so on and so forth. Uh, but really, also, we have it to where ultimately we have a much more interesting Bruce Banner story than maybe even a Hulk story, which I could really appreciate that. Where it's like, okay, they're finally actually establishing Bruce in this story, because really he was just like a kind of a character like in Avengers Earth Mightiest Heroes. Ultimately, like they had like 90% Hulk in there, 10% Banner. Like it would just be like Hulk would be just going out or Banner would just be going out with Hawkeye fishing, and so that way Banner could finally have some relaxing time. But then eventually, like that time is eventually going to be a moot. But eventually, of course, Banner has to forcibly turn back into the Hulk again and not have enough time to ultimately just enjoy the small things. So going into here, yeah, really liking these episodes. If ultimately you guys saw some of the other episodes and you were unsure, I would say these episodes are way more interesting than I think those other ones were. Because ultimately they were kind of a lead up to kind of sell you on either other shows that were going on at the time, or ultimately they were just to kind of just ultimately kind of tie in some characters to Hulk, because they were they were maybe kind of either unsure about what to do with exactly like Hulk. I think in the very beginning of this, but I think now they're finding their footing and they're being able to just like, okay, well, instead of using guest stars and special people and whatever, how about we just put out a really good Hulk story that has these Hulk characters, and that's where they end up going with this. So, speaking of going, let's go into spoiler time. let's ultimately branch out. Ultimately, I apologize if there's only 4 episodes. When looking at it, I had a full plate of other kind of numerous things to review as well here. I ended up also like reviewing some other things that ultimately will probably not be shown on this day and probably will be shown a day before or whatever, because ultimately I'm assuming to just kind of use this as an extra for some day. So, anyways, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this show. So, spoilers now. So, we end up having it to where in episode 10, we have it to where there is an episode with Wendigo. And I'm like, yeah, Wendigo! Yes. I was happy when we have the Wendigo. Because when looking at it, I was like, okay, well, Wendigo has been in some like Wolverine books. I think he was in like a Wolverine She-Hulk book, and like I've kind of seen this character kind of sporadically when looking at it. I think they really do establish a Wendigo like character or just a character that is in a snowy environment when they want to try to sell a book to you cheaply or to make like an inker's job like really easy. Because when looking at it, like I've seen it to where ultimately someone would say like, hey, like how about you try to make the environment just as white as humanly possible. So ultimately, like we don't have to ink as much, or we don't have to color in as much. And so ultimately, that's when they usually throw in and toss in a wintry environment, so they can kind of cut costs on having to use so much ink or whatever. So I just thought that was interesting. I think I ended up watching, I think like the first movie Ghost Rider's featurette, where it kind of explained like the whole backstory of Ghost Rider, and I watched that numerous times over, and ultimately they talked, I think somewhere in there, about having an all white background to ultimately just have it to where the book could fly out cheaper. So going into here. So we end up having it to where uh, Banner is on his way to some part of place, and we end up having to where Betty ends up going and flying out to get there before ultimately a Shield or a Ross gets there. So we have it to where Betty could try to protect Banner and get the drop uh, on Banner to get him away from where Shield or Ross is going to ultimately look for him. So Betty's flying off. So we end up having to where Banner is to make his way towards the woods, of course, and it seems that eventually we end up having it to where uh, the Banner, or AKA Hulk, uh, we end up having it to where Banner is mixed up, or Hulk is mixed up with a Wendigo. So we end up having it to where ultimately that this Wendigo and Banner end up getting mixed up with one another, and we end up having, of course, them fighting, and of course, this is interrupted by a Native American who is ending up doing a chant. A chant of sorts that ultimately ends up nullifying and soothing the savage beast, which ultimately seems like, if you guys of course know like the Black Widow maneuver to the Hulk, it's kind of the same thing. The sun is getting really low, that kind of maneuver. So we end up having it to where ultimately Wendigo is to of course turn into a normal man, and Hulk is to end up turning into Banner. And so Banner is just baffled and confused how honestly a chant could ultimately nullify Hulk turning into Banner. Like, how is it that they could? Banner is just like, what is that recipe? What is that chant? How can I learn it? So that way, if there's ever a time where ultimately the Hulk is going to pop out, I can just pop in a disc cassette of somebody chanting and ultimately just nullify that. So we end up having it to where Banner is ending up trying to start living with these Native Americans. And eventually we end up having it to where ultimately Ross ends up going and scooping up Banner. And we end up having it to where Ross ends up scooping up Banner, and we ultimately end up having it to where they end up throwing the cuffs on Banner. And all while that is going on, we're ending up having Banner ultimately getting angry. And what ends up happening is Banner ends up taking one of the cuffs and putting it on Ross. So we end up having to where Banner is changing into the Hulk, and he is slapping a cuff on himself, but then eventually he's also slapping a cuff on Ross. So we end up having it to where, of course, Hulk gets so, of course, strong as per usual, gets out of this helicopter while it's, I guess, in midair, and all while Ross is like hanging on for dear life. So we end up having it to where like Ross is just getting thrashed by Hulk, just repetitiously, just making his way through the forest and through everywhere. You could just see him consistently just getting thrashed. It's freaking hilarious. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Ross is really desperately calling for a truce to ultimately just say like, hey, hey, could we chill out for a bit? Can we relax for a bit? Like, ultimately, I'm going to try and get these cuffs off and, like, let me try something. And the Hulk is just like, nah. Like, he ends up just taking a rock and is trying to, like, bash the cuffs off. But we end up having Ross saying, dude, that's not going to work. So eventually we have it to where Ross ends up trying to figure out a code combination for this to work. And ultimately, we end up finding out that Ross says, like, dude, you broke the mechanism. Now the cuffs are cuffed for good. So, or we are to suppose. So, we end up having to where reasonably that Ross is trying to get rid of Hulk for Betty. We have it to where ultimately Ross in this episode is kind of talking to the Shield guy Gabriel, and like he's kind of having an issue between juggling being a father and being a general. Reasonably kind of interesting dialogue going on here, and so reasonably we go in here and we ultimately have it to where we end up finding it to where ultimately the Wendigo is to eventually come from man to Wendigo again, and we eventually have it to where this Wendigo is going to similarly go after Betty, and so ultimately we have it to where uh, to where uh, Banner and Hulk have to forcibly work together, or what their equivalent is working together, where like Banner is just, or Ross is ultimately just like, God, I am sick of getting thrashed. Like, please, could we just work it out? Could we just call a truce? And Hulk is like, you're my enemy. And it's like, well, technically Wendigo is our enemy, so the enemy of our enemy is our friend. So we end up having it to where ultimately Hulk, instead of like thrashing Ross, he is ending up having to like try and like pick him up and then kind of swinging. So ultimately, like they're at least quasi coexisting together. So we end up having it to where eventually that Hulk is to make it to the Wendigo, and of course, like Hulk is trying to fight the Wendigo, but again, like Ross is getting freaking thrashed again, to where he's like smacking against this rock, and we have it to where Hulk is trying to bash the cuffs again with a rock, and like Ross is like, dude, this is not gonna work. So he rips off one of his stars off of his uniform and freaking shoves it into the cuffs to ultimately break the cuffs. And that's when ultimately Hulk is to take out the Wendigo. So we end up having it to where ultimately, while Hulk is taking out this Wendigo, we end up having it to where ultimately we see that Betty and Ross are at a crossroads, because ultimately Betty is telling her father that he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand the Hulk. Like, and doesn't understand why she does things for the Hulk. She doesn't do it to protect the Hulk or protect Banner. She does it out of the love for Banner, which is to be Hulk. So we end up having it to where ultimately Ross is saying, like, well, I'm trying to kill the Hulk to ultimately protect you from heartache, to take your pain away, from ultimately having to try and save this Hulk character, to save Banner. And like they're really at a crossroads between the two, like that. Ultimately, like Ross, I can see maybe his point of view, but when looking at it, I'm like, no, I've never been a fan of Ross. Thunderbolt Ross, I've never been a fan of him. When he becomes Red Hulk, then call me. But any other time, I don't care about Thunderbolt Ross. If he doesn't turn red, I am dead at thinking or hearing or whatever, anything that he's going to mutter. When again he turns into Red Hulk, then I'll just be like, what is that, Thunderbolt Ross? What is that, Mr. Thunderbolt Ross? Anyways, so we end up having a tour. Eventually, the Wendigo is taken down, because ultimately it's fairly easy. Just Native Americans just chanting it out, and you could take out a Wendigo, evidently. So, moving on. So, we end up having a tour. Eventually, Doc Samson is to make his way back into the next episode, and we end up having a tour. They are going to start experimenting on the Hulk, and as well as Bruce. So we end up having it to where Doc Banner is going to end up having to try and outmuscle the Hulk, which is hilarious, but go ahead and try. So we end up having it to where Doc Samson ends up taking down the Hulk. It seems that ultimately it is lucky enough that that Talbot had been able to let him go and be released to be able to go after the Hulk. So we end up having it to where in this episode we end up having them finally ending up taking down the Hulk and ending up going and transferring the Hulk out to be experimented on. So what ends up happening is they conduct a nutrient bath to ultimately separate both Bruce and Hulk. And so we end up having it to where, like, basically in this entire episode, we end up having them try this experiment, and then eventually we end up having it to where ultimately they end up are kind of back and forth about what to actually do with the Hulk. And it seems like there's a lot of people, like, they're bidding on what to do with the Hulk, basically. All while we also have it to where Banner, on the other hand, is we have it to where almost Thunderbolt Ross is almost wanting Banner to just be dead as well. It's like, no, it's not good enough that ultimately we had to kill the Hulk. We should probably kill Banner too, just because. Like, he has the scientific information to quite possibly create another one of these, so maybe we should just pow, you know? Maybe we just do a little pow-pow, you know? With a little Banner, we should do a little pow-pow. So going on into here, we ultimately have it to where, like, at first they want to, like, cryogenically freeze the Hulk because they are not sure exactly what is going to happen to either Hulk or Banner. Like, nothing is quite sure yet. But we ultimately have it to where Thunderbolt Ross comes in and he's like, no, I want that guy dead. Like, I want him as deadly possible. We ultimately have it to where Doc Samson is like, well, wait a minute. What if we can take this Hulk and basically, like, this Hulk is basically all of the knowledge of prior events gonzo. So what if we could like retrain this Hulk? Maybe we can maybe we can train him into a much better Hulk than there was before. Maybe he can be an intelligent Hulk. Maybe we can give him a hot dog and maybe he'll be happy about it. I don't know. But so we end up having a door. Thunderbolt Ross is like, oh no, I just want that thing dead. I just want that thing just deader than dead could be. Because ultimately, it's like I don't want him to get loose and ruckus all over the town because that's always what he does. Every single episode, just ruckusing all over the town like a good old ruckuser. So we end up having Gabriel from Shield coming in. It's like, well, I'm afraid not, Thunderbolt Ross. We end up having it to ultimately that Shield is saying, well, like the whole contract of us working with Ross is to ultimately come in and take the Hulk for ourselves. So we end up having it to where everybody's hot dogging it and everybody wants the Hulk. Everybody wants a slice of that Hulk. Everybody's like, give me a slice of Hulk. And so we end up having to eventually, basically, the Hulk lands in the absolute wrongest of hands. Because we end up having it to where ultimately there is a leader goon that is ultimately hearing all this debate, hearing all this debacle. And so eventually we have it to where the Hulk ends up in the leader's hands instead of anyone else's. So we end up having it to where ultimately the leader is to take the Hulk and to try and do a switcheroo where we have it to where the leader is trying to re-engineer basically Hulk, meaning that the leader is going to try to take the Hulk's strength as well as the leader's intelligence. So like a double whammy, like villainous character. And so we end up having it to where the leader is just wrecking house. We end up having to where the leader is slowly but surely. Here's the problem, though. When the leader is to get the Hulk's strength, we end up also having it to where it seems like the leader is also getting a little bit of the Hulk at some points in time. We end up having it to where the leader is ultimately going and starting to sound like the Hulk or starting to act like the Hulk. We end up having it to where the leader is ending up not being able to control his own body because ultimately, like, it seems that the leader and the Hulk are kind of getting meshed together. And so what ends up being a really good experiment before ends up going like horribly awry. And so we end up having it to where yet again we end up having it to where the leader ends up trying in desperation to go and try and reverse this whole experiment that he did upon himself because ultimately this is not working out. Because ultimately he's just like, he's not in his absolute control of body. He's starting to become the Hulk. He's starting to have the memories of the Hulk. And ultimately he's like, at some points in time, he's like, I can't believe I just said that. So, and we ultimately have it to where the leader is trying to demand control, and so says the leader, but the body will not go with the mind. So we end up having it to where they ultimately decide to do away with the leader being the Hulk, and we ultimately have it to where the actual Hulk and Banner are to seemingly start to ultimately dwindle in health, we are to see within this last episode. We ultimately have to where seemingly Banner in episode 13 is going to marry Betty. And we end up having it to where ultimately that we have Banner, who seems to be the only one that can take down the Hulk. So we have it to where Ross is seemingly losing his effing mind and wanting to go and take down the Hulk. And within this episode, we have it to where Ross is just shooting at Hulks that do not exist in this episode because he has just lost his cotton picking mind. Eventually, to where we have it to where Ross is pointing a gun at Banner while Banner and Betty were trying to get married. And ultimately, they were just like, dude, Ross has lost his mind. Like, this guy needs some help. So, because we end up having to where Talbot ultimately ends up driving out to try and get General Ross, and realizes how far gone Ross is, and ultimately Talbot ends up taking Ross's gun from him, and ultimately he's just like, well, hey, like, let's go home. So we end up having it in this very last episode that Banner ends up going and attacking the Hulk, and we end up having it to where because Ross was going to go and attack the Hulk, but it seems that Banner had stopped him, and so Banner had gone and put on a Hulk Buster like armor, and I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. So we end up having it to where Banner is attacking Hulk, and ultimately we have it to where Banner is consistently outthinking Hulk because Banner knows every trick. Banner knows every little beat that Hulk is going to do. Like, we end up having it to where Banner is basically taking down the Hulk one by one, but ultimately and eventually Banner starts to lose out of resources. Because eventually we have it to where Banner ends up going and slingshotting, or kind of does a little rope thing that ultimately has it to where the Hulk ends up getting and tied up to somewhere and hung back and forth. But eventually we find that Hulk is too strong enough for that, so we end up having Banner using all kinds of weapons that this Hulk Buster has, but that really does all for naught. We end up having to where it's consistently that Banner is just like, so we end up having it to where Banner eventually goes and even tosses his own Hulk Buster armor at the Hulk, which ultimately we have it to where the Hulk just kind of just smashes that into a little ball and just throws it off to his shoulder. So, but eventually when Banner has his Hulk Buster legs, we end up having to where Banner tries to trip the Hulk and ultimately tries to subdue the Hulk. But eventually we also find in these episodes that both Hulk and Banner are starting to get sick, and it seems that eventually both of them end up collapsing because they are getting both sick. So we end up having it to where, okay, hey guys, they're sick, go and collect them. So we end up having it to where they go and collect both Banner and Hulk to fuse these two characters together, because we find out that both of these characters can't coexist. They have to combine them yet again to make it to where both of them are both going to live. So we end up having it to where they ultimately redo this entire procedure all over again. And while this is going on, we end up having Ross, who is desperately trying to stop this. and we ultimately find out that seemingly Rick Jones is ultimately who's Luke Perry ultimately goes and because we have it to where Rick Jones is ultimately the person who ends up finding the Hulk and giving the Hulk to the right people, because ultimately we end up having it to where Hulk is just in some cave somewhere, and so we end up having it to where the critters end up the critters from episodes before, the giant snake and all those goofy giant bats and stuff like that, ultimately are to go to help get Hulk to the right people, to the Shield people, to eventually they could do the first experiment. Um, or after, after the whole leader thing, we end up having to where Rick Jones uh, collects to give the Hulk to Shield, but then eventually that goes where it goes. So we end up having to a Rick Jones ultimately to find out that he's like mummified. Ultimately takes all this wrapping all over his body to ultimately reveal that I'm like, okay, why do you have all that mummy bandages all over your body when ultimately you have clothes underneath that? Makes no sense. So we end up having it to where Rick Jones ends up making his way to the laboratory and ends up mummifying himself to go and try to stop Ross from interrupting this experiment. While that is to go on, we end up having it to where Rick Jones ends up dipping himself into that same bath that ultimately both Hulk and Banner are in. So we ultimately find out that once this experiment is resolved, we end up finding out that Rick Jones is now the Hulk, and we end up finding out that also Bruce Banner is also a Hulk as well. We end up finding out that Bruce Banner is the Gray Hulk, or to ultimately be, I guess, what is to be called Joe Fixit, because I think a lot of people ultimately relate the Gray Hulk to, I think, Joe Fixit or some other character. Like, I think I had seen the Gray Hulk in one of these episodes, and when looking at him, like, this Hulk is so weird. Like, this Hulk is so weird. But ultimately, when looking at it, it's another Hulk. And so I guess I can really appreciate whenever I can get to watch more of that. So, really, I kind of bashed through these episodes, but other than that, and some of them are cleanly concluded and whatever, but when looking at it, like, these episodes were really good. But when also looking at it, I hope to be able to comb through a lot more to see where a lot of these stories end up. But other than that, I am going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.